The Tragic Years, France, The Tragic Years, 1939 to 1947. An eyewitness account of war, occupation, and liberation. Sisley Huddleston, 1955. Chapter 13, America Enters. On the 9th of December 1941, Admiral Leahy announced at Vichy the entry of the United States of America in the war. The news was startling, but not for me. I remembered the stages by which America had come into the First World War, after many declarations by President Wilson that she would keep out of European quarrels. I have watched history in the making long enough to know that it often does repeat itself, or rather that men repeat the actions of their predecessors. From the beginning, I was certain that, however many times President Roosevelt assured the American people that they would not be drawn into the war, the upshot of it all was inevitable and therefore predictable. President Roosevelt's New Deal administration seemed to be going on the rocks after the summer of 1937. Armament and possible war appeared to be the most likely way to retain tenure and promote the New Deal, a provocative program carefully analyzed by the scholarly American international lawyer and publicist Frederick R. Sanborn in his Design for War. Human wisdom cannot see far ahead. Nevertheless, there were not wanting voices on both sides of the Atlantic which were raised in warning against the results of a fight to the finish. The finish of what? Of our civilization? By chance, I came upon the statement of the great English military expert Captain Liddell in June 1940 that a long war must lead to a bad peace. You may call me a defeatist, but I insist that victory has less to offer than an indecisive war which leads to an agreed peace. The idea of complete and overwhelming victory is the greatest folly on earth. Such victories only mean bankruptcy, moral as well as economic. And Wilfred Welcock, the pacifist writer, said, "It lies in our power to draw the German people from Hitler, should he desire to continue the war in spite of our offer of a satisfactory peace." William Gallagher, in his presidential address to the Cooperative Congress in Glasgow, at Whitsuntide, 1940, stated, "Of one thing I am profoundly convinced, that the Allies should immediately and without equivocation declare their peace aims. Let the world know, let the neutrals and the German people know, that we seek no punitive peace, that there is room and a place in the new post-war Europe for 80 million Germans to live in peace and harmony with their fellow Europeans." In other words, he advocated what I, and many others, had advocated for 20 years before the war began, namely, a comprehensive peace conference which would endeavor to settle the more vital matters in dispute in Europe without hostilities. Particularly did I advocate a comprehensive conference in my little book War Unless. In another book, which fell stillborn from the press in the fatal month of May 1940, entitled Peace Through Federation, I quoted a number of political leaders, some of them now conspicuously in power, who preached the same solution, alas, too late. I will only cite Clement Attlee, later Prime Minister of England, who said in March 1940, "The biggest fear in the minds of the German people today is that if they desert Hitler they will experience what they experienced after the last war." The objections to any compromise, once the war had begun, were that Hitler would obtain a new lease of life, and another war would occur in a few years. To this, the distinguished member of Parliament, Alfred Salter, replied, "I am sure that if the war continues for 2 years, and finishes by the economic exhaustion and starvation of Germany, another war is certain within the lifetime of the next generation." I have recalled these expressions of opinion in England because they had echoes in America. When Sumner Welles made his tour of Europe on a mission of investigation, the American people doubtless hoped to remain aloof from the war, or, rather, to exercise their enormous influence and economic strength in the direction of a European agreement. His findings were negative, but for a time they aroused hopes in France that, somehow, Europe would still be spared from a trial of strength. The opportunity of America as arbitrator was unparalleled in history. Both the peace lovers in Europe and those who felt that nothing should be allowed to stop a conflict which they deemed necessary looked to the United States, the former for an intervention in favor of peace, the latter for the wherewithal to pursue the strife. Strange as it sounds, Europe, or at any rate the Allies, despite Mr. Churchill's boasts, did not possess the wherewithal to pursue the strife. This was possible only with American aid. Nor could Europe make peace without America. The alternatives were clearly placed before Roosevelt. He apparently believed that he could not be neutral. I had met Roosevelt only once, in the White House, and on this inadequate knowledge, supplemented though it was by conversations with certain leaders of the Democratic Party, I had formed an estimate of his character. I regarded him as a friendly statesman with broad though vacillating views on social justice. It was evident to which side he leaned. He was opposed to any brand of fascism or Nazism, though his hatred of these chains on the elementary liberties of mankind rather blinded him to the existence of another extreme form of totalitarianism in Russia. At least after June 1941, he appeared to think that Russia had struck out a new path which would eventually lead to greater liberty. When Churchill, forgetting his own bitter diatribes against Bolshevism, plumped wholeheartedly for Russia as against Germany, dubbing Germany enemy number one, to be smashed at all costs, even at the cost of extending the domain of Bolshevism, he found in Roosevelt his alter ego. The two men, one representing the British Empire, which covered the four corners of the world but was now in danger of disintegrating, the other representing a great expanse of compact territory, far more advanced in the practical application of material science than any other nation, understood each other on this point from the outset, although their backgrounds and motives were quite different. One stood for the traditional might of a past in peril, the other, remembering the European origins of America and opposed to European colonialism, stood, at least in his rhetoric, for the triumphant future. I judged Roosevelt to be a unique mixture of emotionalism and political astuteness, a born politician who knew how to manage the masses. On this, then, Churchill and Roosevelt were agreed, though they were agreed on few others, the immediate aim of smashing Germany. They were willing to set aside everything else in the pursuit of that objective and to let tomorrow take care of itself. How well the morrow took care of itself is clearly seen. The British Empire has crumbled, the continent is politically chaotic outside of Russia, Russia is dominant in the Old World, and we face daily the menace of a Third World War. In France we look to America to rescue us from Germany's clutches. But how? By force of arms, by economic pressure, or by authoritative mastership imposing a new conception of a united world on the belligerent nations? After the German attack on Russia, it was argued that America could not defend democracy by fighting for and with Russia, for, if Russia won, the Bolshevization of Europe would follow. Much as Germany, that is to say Nazism, was detested, it was thought in some American quarters illogical to support Russia, that is to say Bolshevism, which was equally or more detested. The confusion was hardly clarified by those Americans who declared that two totalitarian systems were at war. The unique enemy was totalitarianism, not Nazism, not Bolshevism as such, but totalitarianism in any form. To help Germany against Russia or Russia against Germany was to help totalitarianism. The dilemma compelled many Americans to cry, "A plague on both your houses. Let them destroy each other." This point of view Senator, later President, Truman set forth with great vigor at the time of Hitler's attack on Russia. Subsequent events have amply proved that this was a far more statesmanlike and far-sighted policy than that of Churchill and Roosevelt. While it is now well known, and General Marshall confirmed it in his final report on the war, that Hitler had not even the most remote plan of attacking the United States, the war party in that country circulated wild stories about German plans to occupy the United States as soon as Western Europe had fallen. President Roosevelt actually talked dimly about Hitler's timetable to invade the Middle West of America via Dakar and South America, even though the distance from Brazil to Iowa is greater than that from Berlin to Iowa. After the fall of the Low Countries in France in 1940, the interventionists gathered added strength in the United States and, from then onward, it was only a matter of time when the United States would enter the conflict. President Roosevelt sent Harry Hopkins to London to assure Churchill of American support in the war. On January 11, 1941, Hopkins told Churchill, "The President is determined that we shall win the war together. Make no mistake about it." Secret Anglo-American staff conferences began in that month and lasted through March. At their end, the American naval commander, Admiral Stark, wrote to his fleet commanders, "The question of our entry into the war now seems to be when and not whether." 9. Many of the president's advisers wished to make war on Germany right after France fell, but the non-interventionist sentiment in the United States was overwhelming right down to the day of Pearl Harbor. Further, despite a long list of belligerent acts toward Germany and Italy, shipment of a vast volume of small arms to Britain right after Dunkirk, the stripping of American air defenses to be sent to Britain, Russia, and China, which led to the resignation of Secretary of War Woodring, the destroyer base deal of September 1940, extensive material aid to Britain short of war after Lend-Lease, convoying American and British vessels carrying war materials to Britain and later Russia, and the order to shoot on sight German submarines seeking to sink such vessels. Germany and Italy declined to take up the gauge of battle, as Roosevelt and Churchill hoped they would. Hence, the latter had to seek a way into the war through the back door of Japan and the Pacific. It was for this purpose that Churchill and Roosevelt met off the coast of Newfoundland in August 1941. The decision made here led straight to Pearl Harbor. Indeed, the road to Pearl Harbor had been decided the month previous by the drastic embargo imposed on Japan. For events, especially, heralded the entry of America into the war. The first was the determination, even if it meant war, to aid England to the limit, running through the shipment of arms and airplanes to Britain, the destroyer base arrangement, Lend-Lease, and, finally, the decision to escort cargoes across the Atlantic and place the supply of material to England under American protection. The American policy reminded me of a boxer holding out his chin. Sooner or later it would be hit unless Germany abandoned her attacks on shipping and left the Atlantic free. The second was the signing of the Atlantic Charter, ostensibly setting forth their common aims for a better post-war world by Churchill and Roosevelt on the 14th of August 1941. The third was the virtual blockade of Japan. The fourth premonitory sign was the intensive preparation of North Africa by the government of Vichy to receive American troops. No one who followed events intelligently could be mistaken as to the meaning of these preliminaries. The Churchill-Roosevelt interview on board a battleship somewhere in the Atlantic was a curious meeting between the Prime Minister of a belligerent country and the President of a country as yet non-belligerent. Judging it from the French viewpoint, in spite of its theatrical setting, it fell singularly flat. The charter did not produce the impression in Europe that it might have done had it been couched in more vigorous terms. It struck one as a perfunctory piece of work. It had not the power of Wilson's 14 points which so largely contributed to Germany's collapse in 1918. The charter, which it is cynically and dolorously interesting to read today, expressed hope for a better future for the world by the conjunction of the national policies of England and America. It did not favor any territorial changes unless they were in accord with the will of the interested peoples freely expressed. This pious hope has not been achieved, since a large part of Germany has been taken by Poland, and a large part of Poland has been taken by Russia, and all the Baltic states have become Russian, and considerable tracts in the Balkans have gone to Russia, and the whole of the New Poland, and half of Germany, and the whole of the Balkans are under Russian control, without any consultation of the interested peoples, not to mention the Near East where new states have been created and old ones extended, or the Far East where the expansion of Bolshevism has become formidable, if not overwhelming. The right of peoples to choose their own form of government was proclaimed, and on the non-fulfillment of this desideratum since 1944 it would be superfluous for me to comment. As for the participation of all states, large and small, victor or vanquished, on a basis of equality, in the pool of raw materials which they need for their economic prosperity, it remains to be conceded. The same remark applies to the promise of international collaboration, in order to assure for all better conditions of work, of economic progress, and of social security. After the final destruction of Nazi tyranny, peace was to be established, and all nations were to live in safety, freed at last from want and fear. Alas, 9 years after the defeat of Nazism, freedom from fear or want has not yet come to a world in which peace has never been so precarious, fear so prevalent, and want so widespread, and in which imprisonment, deportation, slavery, and death are the penalties for deviation from official opinion. There is, of course, a clause about the freedom of the seas. And, finally, the employment of force is deprecated, and the general disarmament of nations is advocated. The crushing burden of armaments, said the Charter, is to be lifted from the shoulders of the peace-loving nations. Unhappily, the burden of armaments is now vastly heavier than ever, and weapons whose destructive power exceeds anything we imagined in the wildest nightmare before 1941 are being prepared in feverish haste. Far be it from me to repudiate these amiable sentiments. The Charter, destined to furnish a moral basis for the war, is unexceptionable, but it furnishes a striking example of the vanity of human wishes and of the hypocrisy of official propaganda. As for the negotiations with Japan, conducted mainly by Secretary Cordell Hull until July 1941, it was plainly to be seen that they would fail. I have often reflected regretfully that Japan had been a valued ally in the First World War and that, with her demolition, the last barrier to Bolshevism disappeared in the East. England had long preserved friendship with Japan, realizing that she was the only efficient country of the Orient, but Japan was tempted to expand at the expense of China, and certain factions in America were incensed at her war of conquest in a disrupted country. Secretary of State Henry L. Stimson wished to impose sanctions and, perhaps, war on Japan in 1932, but he was sternly restrained by President Hoover, a firm friend of peace. President Roosevelt was a romantic but ardent partisan of China because, as he frankly admitted, his ancestors had enriched themselves through trade with the Chinese a generation earlier. The League of Nations was powerless, and I saw Japan walk out of the League rather than be censured. Now, in 1941, the United States demanded the withdrawal of Japan from China, Japanese ships were seized, the Panama Canal was closed to Japan, petrol and war materials were refused. American diplomacy was in an impasse, Japan could not retreat without loss of prestige. Japan's efforts to reach a diplomatic settlement, including extensive concessions in the Far East and a meeting between Premier Konoye and President Roosevelt, were rejected by Secretary Hull, with Roosevelt's approval. The peril loomed darkly but, nevertheless, the American ships in Pearl Harbor were surprised by an attack from the air on December 7, 1941. It is not my business here to inquire where the blame lies for the disaster of Pearl Harbor, where 6 of the largest American warships were sunk or disabled, besides a number of cruisers and destroyers. The matter has been handled most completely and accurately by the American writer George Morgenstern in his Pearl Harbor, The Story of the Secret War, the conclusions of which were later confirmed by the greatest American historian of the time, Charles Austin Beard, in his President Roosevelt and the Coming of the War, 1941. All America was aroused. It was now a fight to the finish. England, in her turn, immediately declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The European war had become, almost overnight, a world war. We in France were intensely interested spectators. We could be no more, but we were vividly conscious that, at last, there was some real prospect for the deliverance of France. We had maintained our faith, we had entertained hopes, but these had hitherto not been based on realities. When England stood alone against Germany, even though America sent arms, there was no solid reason to expect a German defeat. It is foolish to suggest that de Gaulle and his adherents, few in number and totally dependent on England, changed the odds in the slightest degree. The resistance of Russia, after the first huge defeats, was gradually stiffening but, as yet, no sensible gambler, looking on with a cool eye, would have risked his money on a Russian victory over Germany. Now, however, with America committed to the fight, the balance was tipped against Germany. The whole outlook changed. The position before Pearl Harbor was, on one side England, with insufficient troops, material, and money, with shipping that was barely able to maintain a regular supply of necessities, and Russia with inexhaustible manpower but in retreat, on the other side an apparently invincible Germany, armed as no other nation was armed, her prestige unshaken, though she had not won either in the steppes of Russia or on the sands of Africa, supported by a feeble Italy, a handicap but not an enemy. Had the position been stabilized on those lines, the prospect would not have been encouraging. The new lineup of forces completely transformed the situation. America might take years to develop her full strength, but it was certain that, in the end, she would be more than a match for Germany, on account of her greater population and her incomparably greater industrial potential. Japan, in some measure, counterbalanced the American effort, but still the margin in favor of the Allies was considerable and would rapidly grow larger. If the year 1942 continued to show the immense might of Germany, from the hour of Japan's fatal move the final result could hardly be in doubt. The war might be long, but its issue was now all but certain. So thought all Frenchmen whose passions did not warp their judgment. Until 1942, they might well be excused for their skepticism, but after that year those who could not or would not read the writing on the wall were men who were blinded by their political convictions or commitments. There were some who were so blinded. The principal fault of the French is their love of politics. It has always been so, since the Romans noted their incorrigible lack of discipline, their tendency to wrangling, their hopeless divisions. The recent history of France is the history of a nation in which the sense of national unity has only at rare intervals prevailed over partisanship. Often France has been saved from total ruin only by a last-minute rally round a providential man. The Great Revolution, in which, with Europe menacing them, the French were busily engaged in cutting off one another's heads until Napoleon came along to impose his authority on the rival clans, is the outstanding illustration of the French temperament, and the whole of the 19th century, with its repeated overthrow of monarchs, its oscillations from right to left, its record of violent revolutions and counter-revolutions, emphasizes the salient trait of French restlessness. In 1870, the debacle culminated in civil war under the sardonic eyes of the Prussians. Only a minority of the presidents of the Third Republic retired unscathed at the end of their term of office. Ministers come and go with lightning speed. Governments rarely last for more than 6 months. The number of parties or splinters of parties I have seen in my time is almost incalculable. Outside Parliament, there was always a challenge to the existing regime, from Boulangists or followers of de la Roque, or Doriotists, or monarchists, or communists, and de Gaulle has been denounced by the Fourth Republic as the leader of a faction. Whether the aged Pétain was the right man to choose in the hour of anguish in 1940 may be questioned, but he did offer some promise of union sacrée, as we said in 1914. By 1942, the union was broken. Apart from the diversion fostered by the Smygresses, there were in Vichy a score of organizations, living on secret funds which are a bad feature of French public life, each pursuing its own end, anti-Semitic, anti-Masonic, anti-this and anti-that, organizations for one thing or another, all of them sectarian, none of them frankly and comprehensively French. At Paris, the numerous cliques and clans could hardly be counted. Some of them were for collaboration, others against, but there was always a struggle inside each association, and often it was impossible to tell on which side they were, or whether they were on both sides at the same time. As in all countries where parties pullulate, there were a number of police groups which competed with each other and opposed each other. What was true of France under the occupation was true, both in respect of parties and police, of France before the war, as it is true of France after the liberation. It becomes increasingly difficult for me, from 1942 onward, to speak of French opinion as though it were a bloc. Therefore, when I state that the assurance of American intervention was received with joy in France, and that the end of the Hyderian domination of Europe was foreseen, it must be understood with the important reservation that a variety of groups did not share the general joy. Both on the extreme left and on the extreme right, the prospect of an American domination of Europe was regarded as a misfortune. For the Communists, the distrust of America is sufficiently explained by their fanatical support of Russian imperialism, menaced by American participation in the war. Already, looking beyond the American war with Germany, they sensed the coming struggle between America and Russia, and while accepting American aid, since it was necessary, they minimized America and represented Russia as the sole effective fighter in the field against Nazism. The reluctance of the ultra-conservatives to see America triumphant in Europe was based on a fear lest American civilization, which is, after all, very different from the traditional culture of Europe, should completely change the European mentality. It may be thought odd that, even before the protagonists had taken their respective stands, before the issue was joined, Frenchmen should discuss a future which was yet undefined. That is, however, in keeping with the French liking for abstract debate. France was, at one and the same time, both inside and outside the war. By a peculiar psychological twist, she employed her leisure, forgetting her immediate plight, to indulge in ardent polemics. Assuming that, eventually, Germany would succumb, there would be left, face to face, two great powers, and two only: the United States and Russia. Could two great powers live in the same world without engaging in a struggle for the supreme mastery? Long before Marshal Smuts delivered his amazing speech to the British Parliament, at the end of the following year, I listened to much talk on its main thesis. The speech was prophetic, and it crystallized what was passing in many French minds. But what may be properly said in private is not always fit for publication, and that Smuts should have forecast the future as he saw it to the British and to the world, for his discourse was given the widest publicity in France and in most European countries, was extraordinary. He announced that the defeat of Germany would leave America and Russia confronting each other. Besides these two colossi, other nations would pale into insignificance. England would be permanently enfeebled. France would be extinguished as a great power. Italy would not exist as an international force. Germany would never recover. A gloomy picture for Europe. What was the purpose of the South African Prime Minister who had become a minister of the British Empire in speaking so frankly? Did he not mean to issue a solemn warning against pushing the war to an inexorable conclusion? The death sentence passed on France was bitterly resented by the Pétainists. The Gaullists were equally perturbed. The pro-Germans were hostile. Pétainists, Jagallists, and Hitlerites were equally touched. What was the use of striving, if France, if Europe, were doomed? England, who had won the admiration of most of the French, was condemned to be a little island in the North Sea, with an empire which would detach itself or treat the mother country as a minor member of the Commonwealth. Europe was a small peninsula of the immense Asiatic continent, without independent life. No wonder that many of the French shrank with horror from the prophecy of a world in which only the two giants of America and Russia would count. No wonder that they rejected either the American solution or the Russian solution. No wonder that, today, when the alarming vision of Smuts is far too completely realized, the alternative solutions are viewed with misgiving. And yet, Smuts was merely saying what Frenchmen were saying more than a year before he made his ominous and disturbing address. We were witnessing the virtual disappearance of small nations, for which we had pleaded since 1914. We were told that material success was in practice more important than spiritual influence. Such realism, however justified by the facts, ran counter to all our ideals. The 20th century has been a profound and tragic deception, richer in promises than its predecessors, poorer in performance outside of scientific and mechanical marvels. No other century has seen such sufferings, has heaped up such mountains of dead. Poverty and famine reign in the midst of potential abundance. Hatred of war has produced the most devastating of wars. We are entering a period of perpetual war for perpetual peace. A tremendous world revolution is in progress, wrote Henry R. Luce, announcing that America's century was opening, in an article in Life, which was given great publicity in France. And if it is to bring good and not evil, said he, we must remember that the 2 billion and more human beings who people the globe are indivisible. Are they? They seem to be splitting up into irreconcilable enemies. Modern wars will be fatal to the species, he declared, and must, therefore, cease. But will they? There's the rub. For the first time, all the material needs of the entire human family can be satisfied. Possibly, but never have so many people lived in utter misery. If Die World is to be saved, Mr. Luce continued, America must make it her business to introduce a new order. America alone can cure the divisions of an indivisible world, can transform the horrors of war into a horror of war, can organize the nourishment of the human family. Unhappily, Russia claims the right and professes the ability to fulfill the same purpose. I was perturbed by Mr. Luce's omission of the growth and the ambitions of Russia. I doubted whether the American pattern of life could be applied to Europe. England was content to yield the lead to America. Churchill spoke of himself modestly as the lieutenant of Roosevelt. Later, the Marshall Plan supplemented America's leadership. But it seemed to me, as to my friends who knew both Europe and America, that each country of Europe not only could but should be encouraged to keep its specific character, its individual genius. European civilization was old, it was too traditionalist, it required a transfusion of blood. There should be the fullest collaboration between two continents which I once described as the two wings of the world. Nevertheless, just as Europe would not willingly accept the German or the Russian pattern of life, so it seemed to me that Europe would not accept the American pattern, which was excellent in America but not as suitable in other conditions. For thousands of years there have been inconclusive discussions and alternating experiences in the matter of government, and it is improbable that the true, final, and universal solution of the problem of ruling men has been found by the United States. From Aristotle to Emerson, from Shakespeare to Carlyle, there have always been political thinkers who believe that all human progress is inspired, not by the masses, but by great men heroes, as Carlyle called them, and, in practice, America, like England, owes her position to her renowned leaders in all branches of activity. It was not in consonance with the teachings of history and of our own observations to seek to standardize nations or to dogmatize about ideas which have only a provisional and conditional value. So, in the absence of other than intellectual occupations, did I and my friends talk and write, for I maintained a correspondence with some of the leading thinkers of Europe when it was evident that the entry of America into the war meant that Europe would be rid of Nazism. We considered that, after many centuries of vain strife, of dismal oppression, of immemorial wrongs, of the misuse of riches, of unspeakable poverty, of governmental tyranny, the hope of the world was that the century should be neither America's century nor Russia's century, but mankind's century. Two giant sovereignties, Russian and American, might not be able to exist side by side, without another war. Two vast sovereignties were, perhaps, more dangerous than 20 or 40. It was not only after the war, but in the midst of the war, that the peril of a new rivalry, after the defeat of Germany, was apparent to anyone who reflected. Not America's, not Russia's, but mankind's century, if a third world war was to be averted.